September 1939, London. The air raid sirens had not yet become a daily terror, but inside the War Office on Whitehall, panic had already set in. Britain had just declared war on Nazi Germany, and the men in uniform gathering around mahogany tables knew a terrible truth. They needed 158,000 soldiers immediately. Not next year, not in 6 months. Now, without them, military planners gave Britain 18 months before total defeat. Maybe less. The math was brutal and simple. Germany had been preparing for years, building an army that now stood at over 3 million men. They had tanks, planes, and soldiers who had already conquered Poland in just 27 days. Britain's army was smaller, older, and desperately short on bodies. The generals had their recruitment posters ready. Join up, fight for king and country, defend your homes. The same messages that had worked in the Great War 20 years earlier. Young men would see the posters, feel the patriotic fire, and march to the recruitment centers. That was the plan. Except it was not working. By October, the numbers came back from recruitment stations across England, Scotland, and Wales. They were 40% short. 4 out of every 10 soldiers they needed simply were not showing up. The recruitment officers tried everything: more posters, radio speeches, public rallies with military bands and flags. Nothing changed the numbers. Traditional methods, the ones that had filled the trenches of World War I, were failing completely. Across the English Channel in Berlin, German military intelligence was watching Britain's recruitment crisis with satisfaction. Their reports to the High Command were clear and confident. The British Empire, they wrote, could not field enough soldiers because their colonial subjects lacked the will and capability to fight. One intelligence brief stated plainly, African and Caribbean populations show no martial spirit. They are suited for labor, not combat. The British will find no meaningful volunteers from these territories. This assessment was taught in every German military academy, repeated in every briefing, accepted as scientific fact. The Nazi racial theories that underpinned their entire ideology depended on it being true. Back in the wood-paneled meeting rooms where Britain's military future was decided, senior officers ironically shared similar views. They had rules, old rules, from the days when the British Empire stretched across the globe. Those rules said that men from the colonies, men with black and brown skin, could serve Britain, but only in certain ways. They could carry supplies, they could dig trenches, they could cook meals and repair roads, but they could not fight. They could not fly planes or command troops or fire the big guns. The official reason, written in careful language in dusty policy books, was that colored troops lacked discipline, that they could not handle the stress of modern warfare, that white soldiers would refuse to serve alongside them. One general, reviewing the desperate recruitment numbers, actually said out loud in a meeting, "We simply cannot put colored men in combat roles. They lack the temperament for modern mechanized warfare." Other officers nodded. This was accepted wisdom. This was how things had always been done. Never mind that the empire was built on the backs of millions of these same people. Never mind that in the last war, over 1 million Indian soldiers had fought and died for Britain. The rules were the rules. But someone was about to challenge those rules. His name was Harold Moody, and he was a man who should not have existed according to the empire's own logic. Born in Jamaica in 1882, he had come to London to study medicine. White medical schools tried to keep him out. White hospitals refused to hire him. So he opened his own practice and became one of the most respected physicians in London. He treated patients of every color. He raised a family. He founded the League of Colored Peoples to fight for equal rights. And when war came, he had already served as a medical officer, wearing a British uniform, saving British lives. Now, in late 1939, Dr. Moody sat in his office reading the newspapers. Stories about recruitment shortages, stories about the desperate need for soldiers. And he knew something the generals did not know or refused to believe. He knew that right now, at this very moment, there were thousands of men across the Caribbean and Africa who wanted to fight. Not wanted in some vague future sense, wanted right now. They had already written letters, 60,000 letters. 60,000 men from the West Indies alone, asking how they could volunteer, how they could serve, how they could help defend the empire that ruled their islands. This number was staggering, unprecedented. It represented more volunteers than Britain could even transport or train at once. And German intelligence had predicted exactly zero. They had bet their entire strategy on colonial populations staying passive, uninvolved, proof of their supposed inferiority. They were about to be catastrophically wrong. Dr. Moody gathered these letters. He counted them. He documented where they came from: Jamaica, Trinidad, Barbados, British Guiana, islands that most British people could barely find on a map. He prepared his case like the doctor he was, with facts and numbers and evidence. Then he requested meetings with officials at the War Office. The first meetings went exactly as you might expect. Polite smiles, careful words. "Thank you for your concern, Dr. Moody. We will take it under advisement. We have procedures, you understand. Policies, traditions." One official actually told him that colored troops might be fine for labor, but Britain needed fighters, not workers, as if carrying a rifle required some special quality that only white skin could provide. Dr. Moody kept pushing. He brought his evidence to every meeting. 60,000 volunteers, men ready to fight, men offering their lives. And the War Office kept saying no, kept citing their rules, kept insisting that this was not how things were done. Even as the recruitment numbers stayed terrible, even as Germany grew stronger, even as the math of survival became more desperate with each passing week. Then Dr. Moody changed his approach. He stopped being polite. In one meeting, he put the stack of letters on the table in front of the generals. 60,000 letters. He looked at them directly and said something they would not forget. "These men are offering to die for Britain. Will you let pride kill the empire?" The room went silent. Because everyone in that room knew the truth. Britain was losing a war it had barely started fighting. And sitting on islands across the ocean were 60,000 men ready to help. What kind of nation turns away soldiers when invasion threatens? What kind of generals let their own prejudice write the strategy for defeat? Dr. Moody's challenge hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot, and slowly, reluctantly, the War Office began to move. The solution he proposed was deliberately simple, so simple that no one could claim it was too complicated or experimental. West Indian volunteers would come to Britain and train at the exact same facilities as white British recruits. They would follow the same 16-week program, wake at the same time, run the same obstacle courses, learn to fire the same rifles, study the same navigation charts, pass the same tests. If they could not meet the standards, they would be sent home. If they could meet the standards, they would serve. No special treatment, no lower expectations, just a chance to prove themselves equal. The technical details were worked out through the winter of 1939 and spring of 1940. Transport ships would carry volunteers from Kingston, Port of Spain, and Bridgetown to Liverpool. From there, trains would take them to training centres scattered across England and Scotland. The Royal Air Force needed pilots, navigators, bombardiers, gunners, and mechanics. The Army needed infantry, artillery crews, and tank operators. The Navy needed sailors for destroyers and supply ships. Every role would be open, every position available to those who qualified. In June 1940, the first test began. The War Office, still cautious and skeptical, approved transport for only 250 volunteers as an initial trial, despite the 60,000 letters sitting in their files. They wanted to prove these men would fail before committing more resources. 250 volunteers from Jamaica, Trinidad, and Barbados stepped off a transport ship in Liverpool. They had spent 3 weeks crossing the Atlantic, sleeping in cramped bunks below deck, many of them seasick for days. Now, they stood on English soil for the first time, carrying small bags with their few possessions, looking up at a grey sky so different from the Caribbean sun they had left behind. Some had never seen a building taller than 3 stories. Most had never felt cold like this, even in summer. They pulled their thin jackets tighter and climbed onto military trucks that took them to RAF training centres. The training was brutal. Up at 5 in the morning, still dark outside, frost on the windows even in summer. Physical conditioning that left muscles screaming. Classes on aerodynamics, engine mechanics, weather patterns, navigation by stars, learning to read instruments in cockpits packed with dials and switches. For those training as pilots, hours in the air practicing takeoffs and landings, fighting the controls of planes that wanted to drop from the sky if you made one wrong move. The instructors watched closely, clipboards in hand, making notes. Some clearly hoped these men would fail. Some seemed genuinely curious. A few veterans who had seen combat themselves just watched the performance and kept their thoughts private. 8 weeks later, the results came in. Out of 250 volunteers, 180 had qualified for their positions. That was a 72% success rate. The training officers checked the numbers against white British recruits who had gone through the same program. 72%. Exactly the same. Not worse, not better, the same. Men who had grown up on small islands, many who had never seen snow or flown in a plane or fired a gun before arriving in England, had performed identically to men who had grown up in industrial British cities. The report went up the chain of command, and that is when the real resistance began. Officials at the Air Ministry looked at the numbers and made a decision. Fine, these men had passed training, but they could not actually fly combat missions. They could work as mechanics, ground crew, support positions. The official reason was never written down clearly, but everyone knew what it was. White pilots might refuse to fly with them. White ground crews might not follow orders from black officers. It would hurt morale, they said. It would cause problems. Documents from that time, now yellowed and filed in archives, show the careful language officials used. One memo talks about potential difficulties with integration. Another mentions concerns about unit cohesion. They never said the actual words, the ugly truth underneath the polite phrases. They just kept finding reasons why these qualified men could not do the jobs they had trained for. Then Winston Churchill got involved. The Prime Minister was many things, complicated things, but he understood mathematics. Britain was losing the Battle of the Atlantic. German U-boats were sinking supply ships faster than they could be replaced. The Luftwaffe was preparing to bomb London into submission. France had already fallen. Churchill needed every pilot, every gunner, every sailor he could get. He did not care what color they were. He wrote a direct order to the Air Ministry. The language was simple and clear. If these men are willing to fight for Britain, Britain must be willing to treat them as equals in uniform. That broke the dam. By December 1940, 1,200 West Indian volunteers were serving in active combat roles. German intelligence officers, monitoring British radio transmissions and troop movements, began filing confused reports. Black colonial troops were appearing in combat units, flying aircraft, manning gun positions. This contradicted everything in their intelligence assessments. Some officers dismissed the reports as British propaganda. Others marked them as anomalies, exceptions that proved the rule. None of them considered that their fundamental assumptions might be completely wrong. The Royal Air Force formed Squadron 139, assigned to protect Atlantic convoys from German bombers and submarines. 40 of the crew members were black. They flew patrols over grey water that stretched to the horizon, watching for the white trails of torpedoes, the dark shapes of German planes. Their aircraft were older models, not the newest fighters, because those still went to white squadrons first. They made do with what they had. The first real test came on a frozen morning in January 1941. Squadron 139 was escorting a convoy of supply ships when German Focke-Wulf bombers appeared from the clouds. Radio chatter filled the air. Target acquired. Break left. On your 6. The mixed-race crews worked together because they had no choice. The navigator called out positions. The pilot banked hard. The gunners fired in short, controlled bursts, like they had been trained. When the fight was over, 3 German planes were going down in smoke, and the convoy ships were safe. Over the next 3 months, Squadron 139 flew 112 missions. They completed 106 successfully. That was a 94% completion rate. They shot down 12 confirmed enemy aircraft. They lost 3 planes and 11 crew members, the same casualty rate as white squadrons flying similar missions. The numbers did not lie. Black servicemen were performing at exactly the same level as their white counterparts. Not sort of the same, not almost the same, exactly the same. German military intelligence, monitoring British radio frequencies, intercepted reports of these combat successes. The reports were filed but largely ignored. The data contradicted the theories, so the data was dismissed. Every argument against them, every concern about temperament and discipline and capability, was being proven false by simple, measurable facts. By 1943, the numbers told a story that no one could ignore. 10,000 men from the West Indies now wore British uniforms and served in combat roles across every branch of the military. From Africa, another 372,000 volunteers had joined the fight. These were not small numbers you could hide in reports or explain away with excuses. Caribbean pilots alone had flown more than 3,400 combat sorties. They had taken off from airfields in England, climbed into skies filled with anti-aircraft fire, and flown their missions over occupied Europe. Their casualty rate stood at 17%, the exact same number as white British units flying the same missions in the same planes against the same enemy. The War Office, the same institution that had resisted this change so fiercely just 3 years earlier, now operated dedicated recruitment centers across the Caribbean and West Africa. In Trinidad, Jamaica, Nigeria, and the Gold Coast, processing facilities handled 2,000 new volunteers every single month by mid-1943. Young men lined up outside colonial government buildings, waited their turn, filled out paperwork, took medical exams, and prepared to cross the ocean to a war most of them had only read about in newspapers. The system that had insisted these men could not fight now ran an assembly line to turn them into soldiers. But Germany was watching, and Germany had its own ideas about how to use this information. The Nazi propaganda ministry saw an opportunity. They printed thousands of leaflets in English and dropped them from planes over British positions where black soldiers served. The leaflets asked simple, pointed questions. Why are you fighting for Britain? What has Britain ever given you? The British keep you in colonies. They treat you as less than human. They deny you the vote. They take your resources and give you nothing. Why would you die for them? The Germans claimed they had no hatred for colored peoples, only for the British Empire that oppressed everyone. Come over to our side, the leaflet said. We will treat you better than Britain ever has. The British command worried about this. In secret meetings, officers discussed what would happen if black troops started defecting to the German side. They imagined entire units switching sides, taking their weapons and training with them. They prepared for the worst, but the worst never came. Military records show that out of 10,000 West Indian servicemen, only 3 defected to the Germans. That was a rate of 0.03%, essentially none. The propaganda had failed completely. These men knew exactly what they were fighting for, and it was not because they loved every aspect of the British Empire. It was because they understood what a Nazi victory would mean for the world. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, America was fighting the same war with a completely different approach. The United States military kept its black and white soldiers strictly separated. Black American troops served in segregated units, usually commanded by white officers. They were assigned primarily to supply roles, driving trucks, loading ships, cooking meals, building roads. When they did see combat, it was in all-black units kept away from white soldiers. The American military believed that integration would destroy discipline and effectiveness. That was their official position, backed by generals and politicians, and supposedly proven by experience. But the numbers told a different story. British military analysts compared the performance of integrated units like Squadron 139 against segregated American units. The integrated British forces showed 31% higher combat effectiveness ratings. They completed more missions successfully. They responded faster to changing battlefield conditions. They had better communication between crew members. The reasons were not complicated. When you train together, eat together, and fight together, you work together better. When you separate people and tell them they are different, you create the problems you claimed you were trying to avoid. On a freezing night in February 1944, Flight Sergeant Johnny Smythe from Sierra Leone sat in the pilot seat of his Lancaster bomber, preparing for a mission over Berlin. The Lancaster was a heavy aircraft, over 69 feet long, powered by 4 Rolls-Royce engines that roared loud enough to make your teeth rattle. Smythe's crew of 7 included 3 black men and 4 white men. They had flown together for 8 months. They knew each other's voices in the dark, could recognize each other by the sound of breathing over the radio. The mission briefing had been simple: fly to Berlin, drop your payload on industrial targets, come home. But nothing about flying over Berlin was simple. The city had more anti-aircraft guns than anywhere else in Europe. The Germans knew the bombers were coming. They were ready. As Smythe's Lancaster approached the target, the sky erupted. Flak shells exploded in black puffs all around them, each one throwing hot metal fragments that could tear through aluminum skin like paper. Searchlights swept the darkness, trying to pin them down so the guns could find them. Smythe would later say it looked like you could walk on the smoke. There was so much of it. His navigator, a white kid from Manchester, barely 20 years old, called out course corrections in a voice that stayed steady even as the plane shook from near misses. His bombardier, a Jamaican who had worked in his father's shop before the war, lined up the target and released the bombs at exactly the right moment. The Lancaster lifted slightly as the weight dropped away. Then Smythe banked hard, pushed the engines, and got them out of there. Every member of that crew did their job perfectly. They came home with holes in the fuselage, but everyone's still breathing. When the war finally brought German soldiers to captivity, something interesting happened. German prisoners of war, held in camps across Britain, met their black British guards and could not hide their shock. These were men who had been taught their entire lives that black people were inferior, incapable of military discipline, suited only for manual labor. The Nazi education system had built an entire racial theory around this idea. Now they stood in prison camps, disarmed and defeated, looking at black soldiers who had captured them. The German officers could not process what they were seeing. One Luftwaffe pilot, shot down over the channel by a mixed-race RAF squadron, refused to believe his captors were actually British military until he saw their identification papers. Another Wehrmacht officer, captured in North Africa, kept asking where the real soldiers were, assuming the black troops who had taken him prisoner were colonial auxiliaries waiting for white officers to arrive. A U-boat commander, pulled from the Atlantic by a destroyer crew that included Caribbean sailors, spent his first day in captivity, insisting there had been some mistake, some confusion in the chaos of battle. One German officer kept a diary that was later discovered in archives. In it, he wrote about his capture by West Indian troops in France. His entry said, "I was told these people were incapable of military discipline. Everything we were taught was lies." He went on to describe his shock at watching black British sergeants give orders to white British privates, seeing those orders followed without question. He wrote about black pilots landing damaged aircraft with the same skill as anyone else. He described black medics working on wounded German prisoners with professional care. Every single observation contradicted his training. This was not an isolated reaction. Multiple German prisoners expressed similar disbelief in interrogation reports. Some became angry, accusing British intelligence of tricks and deception. Others fell into confused silence, unable to reconcile what they were seeing with what they had been taught. A few, like the diary-keeping officer, began to question everything they had believed about racial superiority. Everything they thought they knew had been proven false. The people they had been taught to see as inferior had beaten them in combat, taken them prisoner, and now guarded them with the same professional discipline as any other soldiers. But the deepest shock came when German intelligence finally compiled the numbers after the war. 60,000 volunteers from the West Indies, 372,000 from Africa. Over 3,000 combat sorties by black pilots, casualty rates identical to white units, performance ratings that matched or exceeded expectations. The Germans had predicted 0 meaningful volunteers. They had built their strategy partly on the assumption that Britain's colonial populations would remain passive or ineffective. Instead, they had faced an additional 400,000 soldiers who fought, as well as any in the British military. Their intelligence had not just been wrong, it had been catastrophically, completely, fatally wrong. The evidence was everywhere, undeniable and measurable. Black British soldiers were not sort of capable or good enough for some roles, but not others. They were fully equal in every measure that mattered in war. They flew as well, they fought as well, they led as well. They died at the same rates, which meant they took the same risks and faced the same dangers without flinching. The only question left was why anyone had ever doubted them in the first place. When the war ended in 1945, the men who had crossed oceans to fight for Britain began the long journey home. They sailed back to Jamaica, Trinidad, Barbados, Nigeria, Sierra Leone, and dozens of other places under British rule. They returned as veterans, carrying medals some of them had earned, carrying memories all of them wished they could forget. They had flown through flak over Berlin. They had stormed beaches in Italy. They had pulled wounded friends from burning aircraft. They had done everything the British military asked of them, proven themselves in every way that could be measured. And they came home to colonies where nothing had changed. The same laws that existed before the war still existed after. In most of the Caribbean, black men could not vote in meaningful elections. They could not hold high government positions. They worked jobs that paid a fraction of what white colonists earned for the same work. The color line that had bent slightly during the emergency of war snapped right back into place during peace. Britain had needed them desperately, had begged them to fight, had promised them equality in uniform. But uniform was the key word. Once they took off those uniforms, they were just colonial subjects again. Many of these veterans found this impossible to accept. They had served alongside white British soldiers as equals. They had given orders and seen those orders followed. They had made life and death decisions in combat. You cannot go through that experience and then return to being treated as less than human. The psychological change was permanent. In Jamaica, Trinidad, and across the British Caribbean, these returning veterans became the core of independence movements. They organized political parties. They gave speeches demanding self-government. They used the skills they had learned in the military to build organizations that could challenge colonial power. Within 20 years, almost every British Caribbean colony had gained independence. The men who had fought for the empire came home and dismantled it. In Africa, the pattern repeated on a larger scale. 372,000 African veterans had served Britain during the war. They returned to Kenya, Nigeria, Ghana, and other colonies with new ideas about what they deserved and what they could achieve. The same British officials who had commanded them in battle now expected them to accept colonial rule without question. It did not work. These veterans knew they had defeated the most powerful military in Europe. Colonial governors and police forces suddenly did not seem so frightening. The wave of African independence movements in the 1950s and 1960s drew much of its leadership from men who had worn British uniforms in World War II. The British military itself changed slowly, reluctantly, but permanently. In 1948, the Empire Windrush brought more Caribbean workers and veterans to Britain to help rebuild after the war. Among them were men who wanted to continue military service. The old rules said they could not, but the old rules had been exposed as lies. Britain established its first permanent integrated military units. Black soldiers served alongside white soldiers, not because of an emergency, but because it was simply how things worked now. By the 1960s, the British military was fully integrated, decades ahead of many other institutions in British society. The Commonwealth Armed Forces, spanning Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and former colonies, watched what Britain had done and followed the same path. The model of integration that had been forced by desperate necessity in 1940 became the standard practice across dozens of nations. Military planners studied the data from World War II and reached the obvious conclusion: integration worked, segregation did not. Whatever prejudices existed in civilian society, they had no place in an effective fighting force. Yet for the man who had started this transformation, recognition came far too late. Dr. Harold Moody died in 1947 at the age of 64. He did not live to see the Caribbean independence movements he had helped inspire. He did not see Britain's military become fully integrated. He did not see the memorials or the history books that would eventually tell his story. For most of his life, he was just a doctor who had fought for civil rights, known mainly in small activist circles, ignored by the establishment he had challenged. It was not until 2014, 67 years after his death, that London unveiled a memorial recognizing his role in opening British military service to black volunteers. By then, almost everyone who had known him personally was dead. This pattern of late recognition was common. Many of the black pilots, soldiers, and sailors who had served with distinction received no special honors after the war. Their service records were accurate. Their combat achievements were documented, but they were not celebrated. Britain held parades and built monuments for its war heroes, and somehow the black veterans were often left out of those ceremonies. The official history being written in the late 1940s and 1950s told a story of British courage and sacrifice that was overwhelmingly white. The 10,000 West Indian servicemen and hundreds of thousands of African troops became footnotes, mentioned briefly if at all. But here is what their service actually proved. When Britain was dying, when invasion seemed certain and defeat was just a matter of time, the empire's colonial subjects volunteered in massive numbers to save it. They did not wait to be asked nicely. They did not demand independence first. They wrote letters, 60,000 from the Caribbean alone, offering their lives. And when they were finally allowed to serve, they performed exactly as well as anyone else. Every single argument about racial differences in courage, intelligence, or capability was destroyed by simple facts. The casualty rates were the same, the success rates were the same, the effectiveness ratings were the same, not similar, the same. This matters beyond World War II, beyond Britain, beyond the 1940s. Throughout human history, people in power have created theories about why some groups are naturally superior to others. These theories always sound scientific. They always have official support. They always seem reasonable to the people who benefit from them. And they are always proven false when actually tested. The German officers who could not believe how many black soldiers volunteered to fight for Britain were not stupid men. They were educated, trained, experienced military professionals, but they had been taught lies their entire lives, and they believed those lies because the lies were convenient. The 60,000 men who volunteered in 1939 did not destroy racist theories by arguing against them. They destroyed those theories by showing up and doing the work. They flew the planes, they fired the guns, they took the casualties, they won the battles. The evidence was undeniable because it was written in mission reports, casualty lists, and combat effectiveness ratings. You cannot argue with numbers. German intelligence officers, sitting in their offices after the war, had to file reports explaining how they had missed 400,000 soldiers in their calculations. There was no good answer. They had simply assumed these men did not exist, would not volunteer, could not fight. Every assumption was wrong. The real shock for those German officers was not about quantity, though the numbers alone were staggering enough to change the course of battles. The shock was not that so many black soldiers existed, though 60,000 volunteers from the West Indies alone exceeded every German prediction by an infinite margin. The real shock was existential. Their entire understanding of the world was wrong. They had built their ideology on the idea that some people were inherently inferior. They had constructed elaborate racial theories, written them into textbooks, taught them in academies, used them to justify conquest and genocide. Then those supposedly inferior people captured them in battle, guarded them in prison camps, and demonstrated through simple, undeniable performance that every theory was a lie. That is the moment when lies meet reality, and reality always wins. Always. The German officers who expressed disbelief were not stupid men. They were educated, trained, experienced, but they had been taught comfortable lies that justified their prejudices and their power. The 60,000 volunteers, and hundreds of thousands more who followed them, did not defeat those lies with arguments or appeals to morality. They defeated them by existing, by volunteering in numbers the Germans thought impossible, by fighting with skill the Germans thought they could never possess. The question is never whether lies will eventually meet reality. The question is how much damage the lies do before reality arrives.